Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to our pre-concert discussion with Rebecca Sipus of the Raritan Players with her solo keyboard program, Salonier at the Keyboard, the sixth of our 14 concerts in this 2022 Bloomington Early Music Festival. I am Travis Whaley, the manager of finance and administration for Bloomington Early Music. I'm also a doctoral student in musicology at the Jacobs School of Music. Rebecca, my first question for you is something I think some of our audience may be wondering. What is a musical salon in the 18th century? Your whole program is about people who put on these salons at the keyboard. What is that?
Yes. So first of all, thank you so much, Travis, for taking the time to speak with me. I'm really excited to be here and to talk to you about this program. So a musical salon was an institution. It was a sort of a gathering, a regular, often weekly gathering that would take place in a home. It was usually held in a room that would have been referred to as a salon. The gatherings themselves in the 18th century could have been called a conversation or conversazione, a rout, a roulette, or any number, an academy, any number of other different terms, but they were essentially gatherings hosted usually by a woman, gatherings of artists, intellectuals, philosophers, aristocrats, professional musicians, artists, literary figures, diplomats. So a really rather diverse collection of people who would come together to experience conversation and the arts together. And in many cases, the woman at the center of the salon was herself a musical person, right? Women sort of gained access to musical education in a broad way, especially in the 18th century. And so if the woman at the center, the salonière or salon hostess, had a particular talent for music or interest in music, she could set the agenda of her salon such that it would focus heavily on music. And that might mean that she would play herself, sometimes playing solo, often playing together with friends. And she might also hire professional musicians to come and play in her salon, either together with her or separately. They would just perform for the people in the salon, but then the conversation could revolve around the salon. So the salon historically goes back to, at least as far back as the 16th century, maybe even farther in one form or another. And there are salons that exist today also, and that are still meeting in that regular way, as a way of bringing people together. But the 18th century salon sort of intersects with important phenomena in musical life, including like the rise of amateur music lessons, the rise of public concerts. So women who were very often restricted by social convention from either attaining a formal education or performing publicly could use the salon as a platform to shape their environment and exercise their own musical agency.
That's fascinating. And another question that this leads me to, and you sort of alluded to this, outside of these salons, did these women who really controlled a lot of what happened in the salon, did they have many performing opportunities outside of this, or is this one of the main ways that they were able to perform and engage in music making?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there are very public women who are musical figures, performers during the 18th century. Think of like opera divas, for example. But for these women, very often the salon was their primary site of performance. Women who performed publicly often did so to great applause and celebration, but there were also many occasions where women were maligned or attacked for putting themselves out there in the public realm, and kind of, strutting across the stage, seeming to invite people to look at them or listen to them in ways that were inappropriate, right? According to the social conventions of the day. So the salon was a kind of socially sanctioned way that women could participate in musical life. Now, that's not to say that they always stopped there. Many of these salonières also kind of put themselves out into public in different ways. And the strategies that they used to do that were different. Some of them were composers, but didn't publish their work or published only a couple of pieces. So they sort of took on the role of author, but still were reluctant to kind of put themselves fully out there in the public. Some of them did publish their work, and they used the salon to kind of mitigate the effects of that, so that their public persona was still shielded in some ways from the kind of attacks that other women sometimes sustained for being out there in public. And yeah, so there's a whole range of strategies that women are using. But for me, what's really interesting is thinking about the salon as one of the strategies that women used, even though they were constrained by these social conventions or formal rules around who could get an education, who could participate in an academy, things like that. They nevertheless found ways of being creative, expressive musicians.
Thank you very much. I know that we'll hear three different instruments, I believe 3 different instruments in this program. Can you tell us a little bit about the 3 instruments you're going to play for us?
Sure. Yes, indeed. This program wound up being a kind of tour of 5 musical salons, across Europe in the second half of the 18th century. And because of that, if you have access to instruments that kind of suit the different tastes of each salonier, it's a kind of fun thing to be able to do that. And because this is a recorded concert, I was able, with the help of a great team, to kind of put together a little tour of instruments as well. So one of the pieces that you'll hear on the program is by a woman composer and salon hostess named Mariana Martinez. She was living in Vienna, but allied herself very closely with the compositional style of the city of Naples, the Neapolitan school. So I happen to have access to a really beautiful Italian Neapolitan style harpsichord that's sort of right up her alley. Maybe it's a slightly earlier model, but actually the compass of the piece that she published, this is one of the 2 pieces that she published, and the compass of the piece, the range, exactly fits this instrument. So you kind of play it, if you play it on another instrument with a wider compass, it actually doesn't feel as kind of revolutionary, but she's literally hitting the limits of this instrument in the upper and lower ranges. So that's a kind of fun fact about that Martinez sonata. Another piece on the program is also played on a harpsichord, a double manual Franco-Flemish style harpsichord. And the piece is by Wilhelm Friedemann Bach. So, okay, what does Wilhelm Friedemann Bach have to do with salons? I'm associating him with the salonier Sarah Levy in Berlin, who was Wilhelm Friedemann Bach's only student. She was an upper class, Jewish upper class. I mean, she was from a wealthy Jewish family. So, she had the kind of double limitation of being both a Jewish woman at a time when Jews were not really accepted and didn't have full citizenship rights in Prussia, and also being a woman. But she did get to study with Wilhelm Friedemann Bach, who's the eldest son of Johann Sebastian Bach, and he didn't have any other students during that period. He was kind of a notoriously grouchy person, or so people thought. But she studied with him for years in the last decade of his life. So she herself, Sarah Levy herself, was not a composer. She was a collector. And she was very intimately connected, a collector and a performer. So she was very intimately connected with the Bach family tradition and with composers in the kind of local Berlin scene. And that was what was in her collection. So the second movement of this piece by Wilhelm Friedemann Bach is one that was apparently special to Sarah Levy and her sisters. It appears in a few different forms in their collections. So then the third instrument is one that I'm using on this program to play 3 pieces. The instrument is a really stunningly beautiful English square piano. It's an instrument that many viewers, listeners to the program will not be familiar with. but it's an original instrument from 1780, built in London in 1780 by the German immigrant Johannes Zumpe, or Zumpi, who moved to London and kind of set up shop and was a really innovative instrument builder. And his square pianos, it's actually a rectangle, it's called the square, his square pianos became sort of famously popular across England, also in France, and even in the American colonies and the early United States. So this Zumpi piano is on loan to me from Leslie Martin. I feel like I have to say his name in deep gratitude that he's allowing me to babysit this instrument and use it for concerts. So the three pieces that I'll be playing, that I'm playing on that Zumpi square piano, are two from France, one by the salon hostess, Madame Brion, Anne-Louise Brion, and another by the composer Marie-Emmanuelle Bayon, who also learned to host salons. She was a professional class musician, not someone from the upper classes, but she also kind of took on that upper class custom of hosting salons. So the two pieces from France, where this instrument was again very popular, and then one a set of variations by Thomas Arne, someone who is known to have kind of made the circuit, traveled the circuit of the London salons, including that of Anne Ford, among others. And this piece, at the heading of this piece, the set of variations, it says that the minuet on which these variations are based is not by Arne, but at the request of a lady, he has composed these variations. So I'm sort of imagining maybe it was a salonier who encouraged him to compose these variations. And that's the justification for including that piece. But this Zumpi square piano, I think you'll hear, has like a really, really wide range of colors, timbres, very wide range of volume, and these pedals that create a very, very lush, almost watercolor sound.
I'm very excited to hear the square piano. It's something that I've seen before, but I've never gotten to experience live.
Yeah, there are very few from as early as 1780 that are in good playing condition, and this is one of them. And I'm just so fortunate to be able to use it.
Mm-hmm. And something that is really sticking out to me, I find so fascinating that these are all keyboard pieces. And I mean, you're making informed decisions as to what instrument to play it on, but are these pieces, inscribed for a very specific keyboard instrument, or is it really just after you sort of devote it some thought and do some digging and think what makes the most sense? How do you go about making those decisions for these?
Right. So, I mean, as Travis and I have spoken about, before, I do firmly believe that people play on what they have, right? So if they have a harpsichord or a Viennese style piano or an organ or whatever, they're going to play music on those things, whether or not the music was specifically intended for those particular instruments. That said, it's always nice to kind of hear and experience music on the instruments that are kind of related to, to the music that you're playing. So since I had that luxury, I figured I would go ahead and do that. But for example, Madame Brion is known to have owned not just an English square piano, but also a German piano and also a French harpsichord. And she used all three of them in her salon. Sometimes she used them together. She had two daughters who were also trained in music, both in keyboard playing and in singing, perhaps also in harp playing, which was another instrument that was kind of well associated with women. So the fact that they all learned to play the keyboard and that she had these three keyboards in her parlor meant naturally that she and her daughters would play together, sometimes for their guests. One of their guests, by the way, was Benjamin Franklin, who frequented her salon when he was on his diplomatic stay in Paris between 1777 and 85. So he writes about going to her salon, Madame Brion's salon, and hearing her and her daughters play and sing music together. And he sort of describes what the environment of the salon was like. He would go there and have a dish of tea and a game of chess and hear some music. And he says that he would rarely go to public concerts or to the opera at Paris, and he calls her home his opera because he doesn't go to the public concerts. And he prefers the kind of domestic simplicity, right, simplicity of the ethos of the salon to the flashy kind of virtuosic music that he would hear in public concerts or at the opera hall. So yeah, and he also gave Madame Brillon a glass harmonica, an instrument that he really kind of invented, right? He adapted and brought into its kind of classic form. And he described in a letter, one of the many letters that they exchanged, Benjamin Franklin described playing music with Madame Brillon in heaven. He's sort of imagining she would play the piano and he would play the harmonica. So that also implies that he might also have played the harmonica together with her keyboard instruments in the salon. And we also know that she had a professional violinist who was a friend and who would come over and play with her. Charles Burney, also the sort of famous music historian, visited her and describes playing music together with her and hearing her. And also he gave her sonatas that she sight read, right, of his own compositions. So her home was a very active place, lots of people, international travelers kind of coming in and out. Other professional musicians, including Luigi Boccherini, dedicated music to her. And Boccherini even describes his Opus 5 violin sonatas, the sonatas for violin and keyboard, which are dedicated to Madame Brillon. He describes not knowing how to write for the keyboard before meeting her. And then he met her, played with her, possibly, like that's the implication. So it could be even that the salon was the site where his Opus 5 violin and keyboard sonatas were kind of worked out. So her keyboard aesthetics become inscribed into his work, in his compositions. So that's a way that, the private experience of the salon then spills out into the public sphere through the publication of pieces like that. But the thing that I'm playing here, sorry, I'm going on for a long time, but the thing that I'm playing here, this sonata by Madame Brillon on this program is one that was never published. It was really just for herself, her daughters, her listeners in her salon, her friends. And it's this kind of very beautiful, sentimental, cantabile, kind of singing style piece. At least the first movement is that. And you can kind of hear, a little bit, this very emotional piece with this beautiful cantabile melody. It almost prefigures Chopin, right? And other later French music with these soaring, beautiful melodies. So she had that lyricism already, in the 1760s, 70s.
Wow. Now I have so many questions I want to ask you.
Lots to say.
The first thing, Benjamin Franklin, he doesn't belong there. Like, that's my first thought. Like, what is he doing over there?
Yeah, he actually traveled. He did the salon tours also in London, and he encouraged the kind of growth of salon culture in Philadelphia too.
Wow,
he was an advocate of, as whatever, Franklin, he was a notorious flirt, and probably should have been, scolded more than once. But he was also a real advocate for women's education. And he saw the salon as a place where women could, through conversation and through discussion of readings, they could get an education. So there's these sort of interesting cases where Madame Brillon and Franklin would exchange letters, often very flirtatious, a little bit racy, scandalous, but where Franklin would sort of educate Madame Brillon in, he's clearly teaching her things about philosophy, about politics, and she, in turn, is correcting his French. So she's educating him too.
Wow. And what you're really highlighting here. So I also, as part of the doctoral program, I teach undergraduate music history. And one thing that you're really showing me is, it doesn't really get more canonical than the classical period. The end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century is sort of our bread and butter as music educators. And all I'm really thinking about now is there's a major hole in the way that
Totally.
We
Yeah.
teach this to students
Right.
because, I mean, these
Yeah.
salons, as you're saying, this is a meeting place for not just socialites, but I mean, some of the big musical figures of the time too. I mean, you just
Yes.
mentioned Charles Burney
Right.
is attending these and knows of these women. And
Yeah.
I'm not really sure how to formulate this as a question, but how it's clear that historiographically this has been left out. And I mean, one way I want to ask this is like, what are we missing when we discount these saloniers? Maybe this is too broad of a question. You know, how do you recommend putting this back into music? What can understandings of these saloniers sort of contribute to our understanding of the late 18th century and classical music? I realize that's a broad question. I don't know if I'm getting at what I'm trying to ask, but
no, I mean, look, I think that there are lots of, I mean, there's endless music to study, right? And when we sort of create a music history survey, we know that we're bringing certain things in and leaving other things out. But I think that what's happening in the field now is that people are starting to question some of the assumptions that underlie the way those decisions have been made in the past. So, you know, there are lots of ways that women were involved in the musical life of, even if we're only thinking about Europe, or only thinking about Europe and North America, there are lots and lots of ways that women were involved in musical life in those areas that we don't get access to through the kind of standard narratives of music history classes. So when we say I'm going to teach a music history class, or I'm going to take a music history class, what we're really saying very often is, or too often is, I'm going to teach a compositional history class. And so we, instead of telling the story of music as a component of culture, or music as a component of life, social life or intellectual life, we are sort of hopping from one great work to the next. And what that means is that people who don't fit into the kind of the story of the evolution of those great works, right? This person hands off to that person, or this composition prefigures that composition, which foreshadows that composition, right? That going from one great work to another, we kind of miss the way that music is embedded in people's lives. So one composer who I think is another one that Burney knew and met and listened to, who could become part of that story, even of compositional history, even if we just limit ourselves to compositional history, is Mariana Martinez. So Martinez was the first woman inducted into the Accademia Filarmonica, the Philharmonic Academy of Bologna, which was one of the most important kind of institutions in European musical life. It was presided over by Padre Martini, and had some of the most important, musicians, male musicians as members. So she's the first woman inducted into that academy in the early 1770s. And the way that happened is it kind of depends on her networks, her connections. So she is an extremely talented composer, singer, keyboardist, and she is the protege of the great librettist Pietro Metastasio, probably the most set librettist, right, in operatic life of the 18th century. And Metastasio helps her to craft her kind of way of being in public, right? He knows that if she goes out there in public in too prominent a way, or she would expose herself to scrutiny and condemnation and attack for being like, here's this woman kind of strutting across the public stage, and we can't allow this kind of thing. So Metastasio helps her to kind of mold her career very carefully, such that when she publishes music, for example, the sonata that I'm playing is one of the pieces that she did publish, and this was in the early 1760s. She didn't publish, complex music. She published a light, gallant style keyboard sonata. And she describes herself, and the publication describes part of an anthology of sonatas. It describes her as a dilettante, someone who delights in music, a dilettante, but someone who takes delight in music, as opposed to being someone who has to earn a living through music, a kind of crafts person. She's someone who delights in it. It's part of her, her easy way of being in the world. And that's the persona that she crafts. So what that means is that the vast majority of her musical compositions were never published. Many of them are lost, but a good number of them still survive in manuscript. They're now being issued in modern editions. Beautiful cantatas that are like super virtuosic. The singer, and Birdie describes her this way, she's reported to have had a kind of laser focused voice that she could very adeptly and agilely navigate really, really tricky chromatic passage work, very virtuosic stuff, and never miss a note. She was just completely, every note was sort of perfectly in tune, light, quick. She's on to the next note. She was apparently a marvel. But performing in public, again, as a kind of operatic star or a concert star, would have exposed her to scrutiny and attack. So she uses the salon as a kind of the primary platform for establishing her credentials. People come to visit her. She holds court almost. And she wasn't even, at the time of her birth, her family was not in the upper classes of Viennese society. During her lifetime, her brothers ascended to the nobility. So she's kind of socially mobile, right? Socially ascendant, and yet she's still a composer, right? And so there's she has to kind of navigate that all very, very carefully. But in general, to go back to your question, I think if we really want to understand the ways that women contributed to musical life in 18th century Europe or America, we have to be able to think beyond the category of composition. We have to think about what it meant for women to do things like hosting a salon or collecting scores, right? To assemble a collection, or collecting instruments, or being a patron, someone who supports, whether financially or in other ways, the publication of new compositions. There are lots of ways of participating in musical life that help to shape musical life that are not necessarily composing.
I'm learning so much. This is just also fascinating, and
thank you.
Really highlighting all of that. And I really like the way you put that. Composition is not the only musical act. And so you mentioned collectorship and collecting. Does that play a role in any of these saloniers? Do we know anything about their collections? And does that help us understand these women by the music that they collect?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of salonier and other musical women assembled collections, but the one on today's program who's kind of most closely associated with collecting is Sarah Levy. So I spoke about her a little bit a few minutes ago. She was, as I said, not a composer, or at least she never signed her name to any compositions that have come down to us. It's very possible that because her teacher was Wilhelm Friedmann Bach, she learned some of the Bach family method of composing, who knows. In any case, she assembled a vast collection of musical scores, many of which she stamped with her name. She had a particular kind of ex libris stamp, which said SS Levy for Sarah and Solomon, or Zamuel Levy, that was her husband. He was a flutist and she was a keyboardist, and they would play together. But so she stamped her name on, let's say, between 400 and 500 scores that have survived today. And starting in the 1810s, she began donating many of them to the bourgeois choral institution in Berlin called the Singakademie, or the Singing Academy of Berlin. So they started, that academy started creating a larger collection, and her collection was subsumed within that. But it was there, a little bit later, in that decade, that her great nephew, Felix Mendelssohn, sort of went to study music. He was studying with the director of the Singakademie, Carl Friedrich Zelter, and he probably encountered scores in the Singakademie collection with the ex libris, right, the ownership mark of great aunt, who was still alive and, lived for decades more. He knew her, I'm sure, and he would, participate in musical events that she was also participating in. It's quite likely. But in addition to that, they were also connected through the Singakademie. So there are some pieces that are preserved in the Levy collection that are uniquely preserved there that we would not have if she hadn't preserved them for us. Others that are simply they're kind of a testament to her own musical practices. So the scores that she collected and donated, most of them are in part book formats. They're chamber music in part book formats, meaning there's a separate part for the violinist or the flutist or the keyboardist, which also means that they were books that were being used. They weren't just sitting on a shelf, right, or there to look nice. They were functional. They served the purpose of making music in her salon. Now, in all honesty, I have to confess that the great majority of music that Sarah Levy would have played in her salon was chamber music, together with her husband and others in her circle. She also commissioned and owned scores of concertos and larger orchestral works, and played concertos, indeed some very, very difficult concertos. But what I have here, for today, because this is a solo program, I decided to include this solo concerto, right, a concerto for solo keyboard by Wilhelm Friedman Bach.
And I mean, talk about collection as a musical act. I mean, the fact that many of her scores ended up at the Zing Academy, I mean, that becomes sort of central to part of music history as we know it today.
Yeah, indeed. One of the things, sort of thinking about Levy's Jewishness, I think is also a kind of interesting angle. So maybe I'll just say a couple of words about that, if that's okay.
Please.
Maybe more than a couple of words.
Yeah.
But the fact that unlike many in her family and her social circle, Levy and her husband they clung to their Jewish identity kind of insistently. Many in their circle, including later on the Mendelssohns, converted or assimilated and kind of tried to blend into the larger Prussian society. And in some ways, Levy's family was also kind of in a reforming mode, right? So she had definitely, she and her family adopted the dress and hairstyles, for example, of, non-Jews in their orbit. But she also supported Jewish institutions like a Jewish orphanage in town. I actually have found a letter that says she took in an orphan in the 1780s. She never had children of her own, but she did take in an orphan, probably from the Jewish orphanage. And in addition, she underwrote the publication of some Hebrew language volumes, which were part of the movement known as the Jewish Enlightenment, or the Haskalah. So there were a lot of discussions, even in late 18th century Berlin, Prussia, about whether Jews could even participate in contemporary German life, Prussian life, as far as participating in musical culture or in literature. Like, were Jews really people who could do that kind of thing, or were they all just backwards and ignorant? So there's a real kind of latent anti-Judaism that's informing a lot of the discussions around Jewish emancipation, whether Jews should be allowed to become Prussian citizens. And so here's Levy. She doesn't write about this, but here she is assembling a collection of scores that is, kind of almost incomparable. And she's performing in her salon, and later on she begins performing concertos. In around 1806, she begins performing concertos publicly at the Singakademie. So putting herself out there again, like sitting on stage and playing Bach keyboard concertos, not simple fare. And she's, in some ways, it seems like she's very quietly, although audibly, asserting her place as a Jewish woman in German musical history. And she's just saying, here I am, I'm a musical person, this is what I do. And that that act of performance and the act of collecting, I think, helps to kind of frame or reframe the discussion around Jews and German culture.
Wow, that's a lot to think about. And but it's sort of a powerful way to think about her agency and the way that she's able to exert herself in a culture that is probably not always kind to her for
Correct.
many reasons.
Correct. I think that's absolutely right. And if we only think about composition, we miss that story, right?
Yeah.
So thinking about, putting these women, each of them, at the center of their own story, instead of just thinking about them as kind of ancillary figures in someone else's story, it really does open up new avenues, I think, new avenues of thinking about music history.
Definitely. Thank you so much for taking time to talk with me a few minutes about your program, and not just the pieces on the program, but how it relates to understanding of music in the 18th century, your research, women's agency in the 18th century, and how women were making music, not just composing or performing, but all musical acts at the end of the 18th century. I think our audience will find this extremely compelling and hopefully informative as they listen to the following program. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you, Travis. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I appreciate it.